To mount or not to mount? That is the question. And armed with the information that shall be forthwith laid out before you, you may avoid the situation that has come many times before. Alas, poor orchid, I knew him well. And yes, that brings us about to episode 12 of our hotly debated orchid care topics: to mount or to pot. What is going to be better for my orchids? And welcome to the Nature Company. Today we're going to be looking at the two viewpoints around looking after your orchids, whether they should be potted or whether they should be mounted. We'll look at the pros and cons of both of these two methods, and at the end we'll go through which orchids suit which methods the most and give you our final verdict on whether mounting or potting your orchids is going to be best. If this is the kind of information you're interested in, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button down below, and that notification bell to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Before we get into these two different viewpoints on what's going to be best for your orchids, we need to understand that both of them rely heavily on not only your climate, your watering habits, but also the specific type of orchid species they are. So let's get into it. Viewpoint 1, mounting your orchids. Here the growers suggest it is a perfect replication of what happens in nature, how they grow out on those tree stumps as epiphytic plants, but then they're able to not only draw the moisture from the watering, but also from the humidity in the air around them. So this is basically mimicking how they grow in nature themselves. So what are the benefits of mounting your orchids? Well, for one, the obvious is they are going to grow the way they would naturally out in nature. They'll have a much more natural growth form, and you'll be able to enjoy what you might see in the wild around your home. Also, by mounting them, you're supplying them with all that good air movement around the whole plant, including the roots. Those roots are going to be exposed to the air and all the natural elements and allow them to dry off a lot faster. So not only are you going to allow for aeration of the roots, allowing them to breathe, but also it's going to allow them to dry off faster. So you're going to have much less of a chance or likelihood of getting root rot or any other root diseases such as that. It also offers a lot less desirable environment for those pathogenic fungi and bacteria to grow. So you'll have less chance of them infecting your orchid. With all of that comes with the lowered risk of overwatering. Now it's almost impossible to overwater because you can spray your orchids. That water is just going to drain straight off the top of the plant, and with those roots being exposed to the air, they can dry off quickly. Also, by mounting your orchids, you land up with extremely strong root growth. The roots grow as they would in nature and expand out much further than they would in an enclosed pot. So giving you a bigger surface area of root volume to allow for absorption of nutrients and of moisture. What does the science say about mounting orchids? Well, it has been found through studies that orchids like Phalaenopsis, Vandas, and many Cattleyas produce much stronger, thicker, healthier root growth when they are mounted as opposed to when they are potted. So with a stronger root system can only mean a stronger growth and stronger plants. And again, we didn't actually need the science to prove it, but they did. Orchids that are mounted are far less likely to get root rot or be infected by root fungi or bacteria that are going to cause problems for the plant. With all that air movement allowing for the roots to dry out faster, there's going to be less of an appropriate environment for those pathogenic fungi and bacteria to cause problems. They're often more prone to causing disease in anaerobic conditions where there's very little or no oxygen left in the media. And here, there's not going to be much chance of that happening. Also, studies have shown that by mounting orchids, you're stimulating the natural growth habits of the orchids themselves, and this generally produces a much stronger, vibrant, healthier root system that is able to sustain the plant better. It's also more resilient to attacks. So you're providing a more resilient, stronger plant that is going to be healthier in the long run. Does this mean we should be mounting all of our orchids? Let's look at some of the problems we can encounter with mounted orchids. So by understanding mounted orchids, that the roots are all exposed to the air and the environment all the time, we need to understand this is actually going to be its biggest problem as well, especially in somewhere like this, indoors. Your indoor environments can be very low in humidity, and this can make it extremely difficult to keep your orchid well hydrated when it is mounted, because these need to be watered frequently. So that's also another shortcoming, is the frequency with which they need to be watered. You're probably going to have to water these almost every day, especially if you have slightly lower humidities. And when you're looking at indoor environments, if your temperatures are high, you may have to water 2, possibly even 3 times a day. And is that really going to be possible? So the maintaining of your moisture content in your plant is going to be difficult. And if you're in dry climates, outdoors, with lots of air movement and low humidities, you're going to struggle just as much, because your orchids will just dry out in a flash. And without automated misting or spray systems, you're going to have difficulty in keeping your orchids fully hydrated. So drying out and desiccation is one of the biggest problems for mounted orchids. So if you are mounting your orchids, it's going to be better in warm, humid climate. And if you can grow them outdoors, grow them outdoors. That way they can at least get the mist or dew that may appear in the early evening or early mornings, just to reduce the water stress on your plant. So we could list a whole string of concerns about mounted orchids, but invariably they all just break down to watering. How much water can you give your plant to keep it healthy? So if that's going to be the biggest problem, is how to retain moisture in your plant to keep it healthy, to have enough moisture to survive and thrive. Well, that's where pots come into play. They're going to retain moisture for longer, allow moisture to be absorbed up into the roots for much longer periods. It's going to help retain moisture in those low humidity areas, allowing the roots not to dry out so quickly, so your orchid can still maintain its turgor during dry spells. So is this the only reason for keeping your orchids in pots, is to help maintain the moisture? It's one of the big factors, especially in dry areas where you have low humidities, or particularly hot areas where your humidities are lower. It's going to help maintain the moisture for your plant. And in doing so, it's also going to help maintain some of that food, some of that excess feed that you may be giving to your plant may be held for longer periods in your media to allow your plant access to nutrients for a longer period of time. So it makes them ideal for in the home, especially for busy people who don't have all week to spend worrying about their plants. So they are an excellent, convenient way of managing your plants more easily. Also, by having your orchid in a pot, although your media is going to break down over time, so you will then need to repot your orchid. With a mounted orchid, that may become more difficult. With a potted orchid, it's way more easy. Your roots are contained in a small area, and you're going to cause less damage to your roots by removing out the loose media than you will by trying to strip them off a mount. So making repotting and aftercare for your orchid a lot easier. Also, they give you stability and support for your orchid. So especially indoors or other places where you want to display your orchids or move them in and out when they are in flower, it just makes an easy, convenient item to use, as opposed to have to find a hook to hang your mounted orchid from. And again, some of the science, we don't know why they actually needed to do the studies, but studies have shown that the pots do hold moisture for longer, that is then going to be available for your plant to help it avoid dehydration stress. It seems a little bit obvious, but science sometimes needs to do their sciencey stuff to prove things so that we can accept it. And in doing those studies, they also showed the nutrient is stored for longer periods in your media inside the pot, allowing it to be available for the plant over a much longer period than if it was mounted and just poured over. Sometimes even common sense needs to be studied. And another one is the orchid adaptability. A lot of these orchids that have been commercially bred have been bred to grow in media contained in a pot. They've selectively bred varieties that are better suited for pot culture and that will often make them more difficult then to grow on a mount. And with all those pros for growing orchids in pots, we all know the cons just as well. Overwatering is particularly prevalent in potted orchids. We know this is one of the biggest causes of orchid death, and it's going to be more prevalent in a pot than you could ever possibly do to a mounted orchid. Also, along with that comes the overfeeding, toxic buildup, and death to your orchid from loving it too much. Also, again, the less airflow that you get in your pot, the higher likelihood you are going to have anaerobic conditions that can occur inside your pot, causing those bacteria and fungi to go mad and cause root rot inside your pot. Although then again, it does make for easier repotting when you have your orchid in a pot. It also helps cause the media to break down faster. Also, your media is in smaller pieces, so it is naturally going to break down faster than it would if it was a large log or something else that you had mounted your orchid onto. This means you're going to have to repot more frequently. So easier, more frequent repotting, or longer term, more difficult repotting. This is a decision you're going to have to make for yourselves. So which is going to be better for your orchids? Is it going to be mounting or is it going to be potting? Well, as I said right in the beginning, this is all going to be not only climate dependent, but on your watering habits and also on the specific orchid itself. Let's have a look at the specific needs of the two different ways of looking after your orchids. When it comes to watering, mounted orchids may need to be watered every single day. So frequency of watering in mounted orchids is going to be extremely high. In potted orchids, you're going to get away with a lot less frequent watering. So it's going to make it easier to manage your watering as long as you are not overwatering. So once a week is often a good medium to work with when potting your orchids. With humidity levels, the higher your humidity levels, the better off you are going to be if you're having mounted orchids. So mounted orchids are particularly good for those high humidity areas. There's going to be less chance of any of those fungal or bacterial attacks on them. And with your potted orchids, you can go to your medium and possibly even low humidity levels, which your mounted orchids will not survive very well in. The root health of your mounted orchids is going to be a lot more easy to maintain because of all that air movement, that fast flushing of water, the quick drying. You're going to have less chance of any bacterial or fungal infections in your roots. In pots, you have to be particularly careful and vigilant. If you're keeping too much moisture in your pot all the time, it's going to be easy for those bacterial and fungal diseases to set in and rot off those roots. So be vigilant when growing potted orchids. So what are going to be the best orchids to be either mounted or potted? Orchids like vandas, talumnias, and some of those cattleyas, the lalias, they all like to have their roots exposed to the air. Those heavy, thick roots or those thin, fine roots that will tend to rot incredibly easily are better managed on a mount. And orchids like your Phalaenopsis, your Paphiopedilums, even your Oncidiums will generally find it easier to be maintained if they are in a pot. This will allow for enough humidity and moisture around them for them to be grown successfully. So what's the final verdict here? Mounting or potting? Sometimes a hybrid approach works the best, such as this bulbophyllum that we have in a net pot. This is going to not only supply it with the extra moisture that it may need, especially since our humidity levels aren't high all year round, which these bulbophyllums do enjoy. So just by providing with a media that's going to be well aerated, it's going to allow for that extra humidity directly at the plant level so that these fine hair roots don't dry out quickly. Also, things like hanging baskets with a nice rough media in will allow for air movement straight through those baskets and allow for almost a hybrid approach between having a potted orchid and a mounted orchid. This will allow you to grow a lot bigger variety of different orchids that may not particularly be suitable in the environment that you have. So here again, it comes down to the climate that you have, your watering habits, and of course, the specific type of orchid that you have. You need to understand all three of these to know which way of growing the orchids is going to suit you and your environment best. And if you still can't make your decision on any of this, Ed posts up a lot of information in that Buy Me a Coffee link down below on all manner of different orchid related content. So go down there, have a look. There's a lot of information available there for everyone. There is also members only gated content, so don't be shy, sign up, become a member, and grow like a pro. If you have found any of this information helpful, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button down below, and of course that notification bell, bing bong, to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.